Hi everyone, and welcome to our September live event with Heather Thomas. We are once again going to be answering all of your quilting questions, those that you've submitted beforehand, and any that you want to ask live over the next hour. So we're going to get right to it with some that were submitted beforehand, and our first one comes from Cheryl. And she says, when creating a landscape quilt, how do you identify how big or little each section should be so that everything is in proportion?
That's a good question, and proportion is very important in landscape quilts, and one of the things that people often fail at, and their quilts end up looking flat. What you want to remember is that most landscape quilts have a horizon line, and everything that's in front of that horizon line are the things that are closest to you and should be the larger portions. And as you get to the horizon line, they should be of medium size compared to the larger. And the things that are up above the horizon line or in the background should be smaller than the things on the horizon line. So you basically have three fields and spaces in between too. So if it's a bush and it's in the foreground and it's in front of the horizon line, let's say maybe it's 4 inches. And then if it's a bush and it's right on the horizon line, maybe it's around a lake or something, then you probably want to make it about 2 inches. But if it's a bush and it's way far away, we can barely see that it's a bush, it's probably going to be a blob and only about 1/2 of an inch. And so as things go farther back, they're going to get smaller. Basically, as they go up the quilt, they're going to get smaller. And as they go down near the bottom of the quilt, they're going to get larger. Hopefully that helps.
Would you recommend looking at a landscape picture to kind of give an idea of?
Absolutely, that's really going to help. I used to teach a class called Landscape Architecture where we made landscapes from a photograph, but it was different because we didn't use a pattern. We simply looked at the photograph and used a little bit of basic math to do it with, and it made it a lot easier and a lot quicker. But having a photograph handy so you can get a feel for the shadows also and for all that perspective that you need. And that's what it is, it's perspective. Just remembering that things get smaller as they go farther away, basically as they go up the quilt. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, our next question here just came in, and this is from Lisa, and she wants to know, do you use a 1/4 inch seam when sewing your binding to your quilt?
Absolutely, yes. You know, there's lots of different ways to do the binding on your quilt, and you can make wider bindings if you want to. But there's a quilting standard, and if you ever want to enter your quilt into a show, they're going to want that tight 1/4 inch seam. And it's very important that when you pull that binding all the way to the back, that you have it as tight to the edge of the quilt as you can possibly get it. So yes, a 1/4 inch seam, pulled very, very tightly so there's no excess or room between the end of your quilt and the fold of the binding. You want that binding to be nice and tight.
Perfect. All right, our next question is from Claudia, and it's kind of a long one here, but she says that our group just finished a denim quilt top from jeans that were donated for charity. It is 60 by 48, and all of the squares are 3.5 and some are 5.5. We are thinking of putting flannel on the back to avoid batting since it's rather heavy, and they are wanting to tie the layers together to hold them together. Since they've never done that before, they're wondering what they should use to tie it with, yarn, embroidery thread, or what else would you suggest?
Okay, definitely not yarn. One of the things about yarn is almost every yarn that's out on the market has a little bit of stretch to it. And so you'll tie a really tight knot, but once you start using that quilt, it will start to stretch and the knot will get loose. Embroidery floss is a good idea, but your best bet is pearl cotton. Embroidery floss and pearl cotton are really similar, but the pearl cotton is wound. The strands are wound around each other so they don't separate as much, and it's a very strong thread. It's easy to needle, and it's a wonderful thread to tie off with too. It ties a really tight knot. So I would go with pearl cotton and probably a size 5, which is a really thick compared to our sewing thread, but a really nice size to tie off with.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Nancy, and she wants to know, where is the correct area to start machine quilting your quilt? And I know you get this question a lot.
Yeah. There's the perfect area would be to start somewhere near the middle and work your way out. However, that being said, you can also start anywhere you want to on the edge and work your way down or across. However, you need to make sure that you have excess batting and backing at the very far end, because your quilt is going to do some creeping. That's why we generally say have 2 to 3 excess inches all the way around of batting and backing, so that when you quilt from the center out and you push that excess out, you're going to have plenty of batting and backing when you get there. So if you decide, let's say you have a row quilt and you want to start at the row at one end and you want to quilt all the way to the other end, that's fine. But make sure you have more excess batting and backing on that bottom or that last row edge than you do everywhere else, so that you can make up for any scooching that that top does as you quilt.
Perfect. And I know it actually just posted to National Quilter Circle, I think about a week or so ago, but a video that you did on where do I start quilting this quilt. And it's a little bit more of a visual explanation of where you started and why, and where you started within different blocks too, and why you quilted there. So again, that's on the website if you want a more visual answer to that question. We have more questions that are related to quilting. And Judy wants to know what the best way to quilt a large throw is on a home machine. There's so much bulk under the neck that it's difficult to do even when it's folded or rolled properly. Any suggestions?
One of the problems is our perception. And we spend a lot of time thinking about the whole quilt and what we're quilting next and how we're handling all this stuff. And I'm not much of a roller or a folder. I kind of do an accordion thing where I will push part of the quilt up against the inside of that neck, sort of like an accordion, and that allows me to have freedom of motion. Most important thing is how you have your table set up. So the table that your sewing machine is on should be right in front of you, and it needs to be of good size. And then you need a table to the left of you that's the same height as your sewing machine table. Now, I don't have one of those tables, so I've always just used my ironing board. And I simply put it down so it's at the same height as my table. We use that to handle all that bulk, so it's not draping in our lap, which makes it hard to move. We want it all to be kind of on top of the tabletop. So having that L formation of your table is very, very helpful to help handle that bulk. Now, the best thing I can tell you about quilting a quilt of any sort that's bigger than your lap is quit thinking about the whole quilt. Think about what's in front of you, make it a manageable size, think about that area, and then when you've quilted that area, pull the next area in and think about that portion of the quilt. Try not to think about the whole thing. When you think about the whole thing, it becomes overwhelming. All you need to worry about is what's underneath your needle and what you're doing in about, a 12-inch square. Even if you're stitching in long rows, you only need to think of one little portion of it at a time. So try that L formation, get that quilt up off your lap, and let the table support it so that you don't have to. Perfect.
All right, I just want to remind anyone, whether you've been watching from the beginning or you're just tuning in, feel free to submit any questions that you have for Heather. We'll be live answering questions for about the next hour, so feel free to ask anything you want her to answer. Our next one here comes from Linda, and she says, what do you do when you're quilting and your thread breaks and you still have a long way to go?
Well, your thread's going to break a lot during machine quilting, and you're going to run out of bobbin. So both of those things happen, and you have to be able to start again. So the way I do it is I basically backtrack about 3 or 4 stitches before my thread broke, after I've rethreaded and everything. Put my needle down so that it goes through one of those stitches, and then I tie my knot off, and then I try to follow those last 3 or 4 stitches right on top of them, and then I just go. It's one of the best ways I know of to handle a broken thread or my bobbin running out. We just want to have that little overlap so that we have a nice strong end to our thread and beginning of the new thread.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Kim, and she says that she pin-basted a queen-size log cabin quilt, folded it and put it away, and now it's wrinkled. Can I put it in the dryer to get the wrinkles out, or will that distort the layers? I have it hanging over a large table now, but that doesn't seem to be helping.
No, you do not want to put it in the dryer. You want to just quilt it. Again, don't worry about the whole big quilt. Don't think about the whole big quilt, and don't think about the wrinkles. When you have a portion of the quilt under your machine and you're quilting that, you're going to have a little bit of tension with your hands regardless of how you hold that, and it's going to get out most of those wrinkles. If you're like I am, I'm going to throw it in the wash machine and dryer as soon as I'm done quilting it anyway. and that will get out any remaining wrinkles that might be in areas that don't have a lot of quilting in them. But your quilting is going to take care of that wrinkling. If it's wrinkled and it's really a hard wrinkle, then you could keep your iron nearby, and when you're quilting, if you hit one of those hard wrinkles, pull it out from underneath the machine real quick and iron that little area if you feel like you have to. But it's really not an issue. Most of us, you know, will quilt for a while. I'll take that whole quilt when I'm done quilting for the day, if I haven't finished the quilt, and pile it in a pile right on my table, and it gets all wrinkled. It doesn't matter. It's going to smooth out as you quilt, and your hands are going to help that smoothing out. So don't worry about those wrinkles. I think what you're doing is kind of looking for a reason for it to get in your way, and it's not really in your way. Just quilt the puppy. It will be fine.
Perfect. All right. Our next question here just came in, and Linda says, how does one go about blocking a quilt?
About what?
Blocking a quilt?
Blocking a quilt? Well, I guess it depends on why you're blocking the quilt and what kind of quilt it is. So if your piecing was done well, and your basting was done well, and your machine quilting was done well, and you put your binding on well, then a quilt doesn't need to be blocked. So the question is what went wrong that you need to block it? A lot of times if you've quilted heavily in one area and haven't quilted heavily in another area, then it's wonky on the edges and it needs to be blocked. Sometimes you pieced poorly in some areas, that maybe the border was too big, and then it needs to be blocked. So my suggestion would be to kind of look at the quilt and ask, why did this happen, so that it doesn't happen again. But now that you have this quilt, and I don't know what size it is, the best way that I know of to block a quilt is to use one of those cardboard fold-out, I think it's a tri-fold, that dressmakers use, because it has a grid on it, and that grid helps you keep everything straight. So even if it's a bed-size quilt, you would do a quarter of it at a time. So one quarter, then move to the next corner and do that quarter, and then move to the next corner and do that quarter. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the quilt and you're going to pin the top edge or one edge along one of the straight lines on that cardboard, and then you're going to slightly stretch and pull so that you can put the opposite side on, so the corner, the top and then a side, on the appropriate line next to it, and you're going to pin that in place. And then you're going to use a steam iron. So you're going to put lots of water in your iron, and you're going to steam that portion. What that steam does is it gets it slightly damp, and you've got it held in place, and then you can either take the water out and dry iron it so it's dry, or you can wait 20 or 30 minutes until it dries and then do the next portion of the quilt. If it's a small art quilt or a baby quilt and it fits on the whole piece of cardboard, you can do the whole thing at once. One line on the top, one line on the bottom, pulling it, not pulling it to distort it, but pulling it to get any fullness out, the problem that you're having for the need to block it, and then do the two sides that way. But one of those fold-out cardboard dressmakers cutting surfaces is a wonderful, wonderful tool for blocking a quilt. And then your steam iron.
Does the steam, really hot steam, distort cardboard at all, or no?
No? Nope, never had a problem. I think I've had the same piece of cardboard for probably 20 years.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, our next question here is from Lacey, and she says, I would like to know why I can't ever cut my squares straight. I use a square ruler, a rotary, and a cutting mat, and I never get them right.
Well, how long have you been cutting? It takes a while to get really accurate, and it also takes a very smooth movement with your rotary cutter. After teaching for so long, 27 years of teaching, I think I've seen people cut in every way you could imagine, and I wonder how they ever get anything pieced together because of their wonky ways of cutting. It's really important that you have a smooth movement, that from the time your rotary cutter begins the cut and finishes the cut, that the edge of the rotary cutter, the blade itself, is in constant contact with the edge of the ruler. And what happens is a lot of people will move it away as they finish the cut, or they'll move into it as they begin the cut, and so they have very inaccurate squares or strips or whatever. So make sure that you're holding your ruler with your hand like a claw, So it's like a claw on the ruler instead of flat, because flat makes the ruler move. And then make sure that you're starting that cut with the rotary cutter pulled in basically between your breasts. That's where you should have your hand and your ruler. Not way over to one side or way over the other side, but in the middle of your body so that you can get good upper body strength as you're making that cut. And make sure that you start cutting before you hit the fabric and continue cutting until after you've left the fabric. That's important too. And then practice. Practice makes better. If you're a beginner rotary cutter, it takes some skill, so you got to be easy on yourself. But just try to keep in constant contact, blade to the edge of the ruler, and make sure that those cuts are complete all the way through, and hopefully that will help.
Absolutely, and I know you did just do a video for us that will be posted soon on a technique you use and using your little finger on the outside edge of the ruler to help keep everything straight too. It's another great visual that will be going up on the site soon. All right, our next question here is from Mary, and she wants to know how you feel about machine quilting with invisible thread.
Yeah, well, it's not my favorite. A lot of people love the clear thread, and I understand why, because it goes on any surface. But I'm an anti-plastic person. I don't like plastic in my quilts, and that's what the clear threads are all. They're mylar or they're some other type of polyester. They are plastic. Just like I don't put polyester batting in my quilts and I don't use minky on my quilts, all of these things are made out of the same plastic that your water bottle's made out of. And I don't like those in my quilt for a lot of reasons. You can't dry them, or you certainly can't dry them a lot, and you can't iron them. And my machine doesn't really like the clear thread, so I don't like battling with my machine either. So my answer would be, ooh, yuck, plastic thread. But the industry's answer is sure, why not? If your machine likes it and you don't mind the way it looks and you don't mind having plastic in your quilt, go for it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, our next one here is from Denise, and she says, do you recommend using a dark batting when your quilts and your backing fabric is dark rather than using a white batting?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I got to the point where I probably use black batting 70 to 80% of the time, because I almost never use white or muslin or anything like that in my quilts. So yeah, if you have dark fabrics, the dark battings are your best bet, and there's several different brands of them. My favorite is by Hobbs, and it's 80% cotton, 20% poly. Now I just said I don't use poly, but that particular batting has that much poly in it. I can't help it. I haven't found an all cotton black batting. But it doesn't really affect the batting in a negative way, the way that most polyester battings do. So a little bit of polyester's okay if you gotta. And I gotta, because I love black batting, because I love black quilts and black backgrounds. So.
Well, you've done a lot of art quilt pieces too, where you've used a hand-dyed batting or something like that.
Yeah.
You only use that if it's going to be exposed, or when would you use a different color other than white and black?
It's going to be exposed, yeah. So the reason I started painting my battings was just for that, because it seals the edges of the batting itself, and it gives me that color along the outside edge when I don't want to put a binding on. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Our next question here is from Connie, and she says, what is the best way to choose your fabric colors for quilts?
Well, the best way, oh gosh, we could talk for the next 16 months for an hour just on this question. But my first thing I would say to you is start with colors that you like. And so if you really like cool colors, blues and blue-greens, that sort of thing, then say, okay, well, at this quilt I'm going to do mostly blues and blue-greens. But always, in my opinion, pick an accent color. Throw something in there that is going to move the eye across the surface of the quilt. If the quilt is nothing but blues and greens with a white background, there's nothing that makes the viewer have to come and look at it. Whereas if you've got an accent color in there, then it asks the viewer to come closer, says, come look at me. That's what accents do. If you have a color wheel, if you don't have a color wheel, go buy one, because everybody needs a color wheel. If you have a color wheel, you'll notice that on the opposite side of the blues and greens are the oranges and reds. So those are always a great choice for your accent. So the direct complement of a color or a group of colors is a great way to use as an accent. You can also use that color wheel and go to a triad, 3 colors equidistant from each other. The most common triad is red, yellow, and blue. And so you could make a quilt that's mostly blues and reds with a little accent of yellow. That looks wonderful. Another triad is violet, orange, and green. You can make a quilt that's mostly violet and greens with little accents of orange. So use a color wheel. It's a great way to start, but always start with the colors that you're comfortable with, and those are generally the colors that you consider to be your favorite colors.
Absolutely, and I got to bring it up just because I like plugging your classes, but you know you just did a class for us that should be up on the site soon, and it is all about color. It is literally, I learned more in that 2 hours watching her do color than I probably ever knew. So that's definitely one that if you have any questions about color that you'll want to check out as soon as we get that up on the site.
Yeah, I'm really excited. That's going to be up soon. So.
Yes, yeah, it's wonderful. All right, our next question here is from Lucy. And she says, I am using fleece to back a quilt. It bunches up. What is the best way to do it smoothly?
Well, fleece, it stretches, so that's an issue. And fleece is polyester, so that's another issue because polyesters are slick. So I'm not even going to talk about the fact that it's highly flammable, but it's slick and so it moves all the time and so it is going to bunch up. If you're going to be quilting with fleece or minky or any of those things, your best bet is to use a spray adhesive, a temporary basting spray, or pin the bejeebers out of it, meaning that there is a pin about every 2 to 3 inches. Other than that, it's going to move. It's just going to move. So if you keep battling with the moving, the next thing that you can do is you can actually put the whole quilt into an old-fashioned hand frame. It has to be a relatively small frame, so you're just going to put the portion that you're quilting into that frame, and it's going to kind of keep it somewhat taut. Don't keep it really, really tight. You'll break all your needles. Just enough to keep that fullness out of that backing fabric. And you're going to have to constantly move that hoop. One of the things you'll probably learn is that you're probably not going to make a whole lot of quilts with fleece as the back because it's really hard to quilt on your home machine.
Okay, good to know. All right. Our next question here is from Suzanne, and she has a question about embellishments. And she says, when applying heavier, non-stitchable goodies to an art quilt, would you use glue? If not, what are some options?
And I've got a video coming out. Is it out?
I was just going to say that. Yeah. Still in my line.
A class on that, actually, on stitching metal to quilts. But so I glue first with a temporary basting glue, and then I hand stitch everything down. And I try to make the hand stitching augment what's already happening on the surface. So let's say I've got a piece of metal that I'm sewing on that has some ridges in it. I will use my embroidery thread in an accent color and wrap it around those ridges so that it adds to the ridges that are already present. Or if I'm going to sew stones on a quilt, rocks of some sort, then I'll do some wrapping so that I wrap that embroidery floss all the way around, maybe in a star or an asterisk sort of formation, so that the stitches add to the beauty. They become an embellishment on top of the embellishment. If you're going to stitch, either make it show or make it not show. Don't make it show on accident, because that'll end up looking messy. So I tend to say I'm just going to make it show. And if the embellishment is already really fancy, then I'm going to make the stitching very simple. If the embellishment is kind of, not so fancy, like a rock, I'm going to make the stitching very, very fancy, so that they play off of each other really well. So yes, I glue, but only to hold things in place while I'm stitching, and then I stitch.
Yes, and I believe that class is called Creating Art Assemblages, and that one should be available pretty soon. I know that was just going through the editing process, so that one should be out pretty soon, and it's definitely another good class. All right, our next one here. I had to read it a couple times to make sure I understood it right, but this is from Linda, and she wants to know, is there a clear plastic that you can use on a quilt to make eyeglass lenses that will hold up during washing?
Hold up during washing. Wow, that I am not sure of. I know that there's a great plastic that you can use to drape over a tablecloth. And you can hand wash it and all that, but I don't know that you can put it in the washing machine. I think it kind of gets all stuck to itself. So my answer to that one would be, I really don't know. You've stumped me. My suggestion, though, would be to buy a couple different plastics, sew them, cut squares out of them, and sew them onto a piece of fabric, and throw them in your washer, and then throw them in your dryer. That is how all of these wonderful things that quilters use got figured out. Somebody decided to see if it was going to work, and when it worked, started telling people about it. And then all of a sudden it catches on and everybody's doing it. But unfortunately, you're going to have to do the groundwork on this one because I don't know the answer. But try it out first on a piece of scrap fabric, sew it on there, throw it in your next load of laundry, and see what happens, and let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I thought of was maybe a clear vinyl or something that might work to.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about, was vinyl, but it sticks to itself when it's wet, and so I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good luck.
We'll be interested to hear how it turns out. All right, our next question here is from Claudia, and she asks, do you suggest sewing the edge of the quilt with large basting stitches before you start quilting? I have heard some do it to help stop the edges of the quilt from distorting.
Well, the edges of your quilt shouldn't distort unless you've put your borders on too big. So that shouldn't be an issue. Yes, you could do that if you wanted to. It would also help hold things together. Make sure that those stitches are pretty big, at least a ½ inch, but an inch would probably be better, because if they're too tight, then it's not going to allow for the movement of the quilt that needs to happen because of the disparity between the presser foot pressure and no pressure as you're quilting. When it comes to borders, I'm going to kind of add to an answer to the question you didn't ask. If you continually have a problem where the outside edge of your quilt, especially if it's a border, it becomes distorted, chances are you're sewing your borders on a little bit too big. When you go to put your borders on, do not pay attention to what the person tells you in the pattern if you're using a pattern. If they say that you cut this border 86½ inches and sew it onto the two sides, well, if your quilt doesn't measure 86½ inches through the middle of the quilt, then that border is going to be either too big or too small. So before you put borders on, before you cut them to length, you want to measure the middle of your quilt. So the middle from top to bottom, and the middle from side to side, because that's the actual size of your quilt. So even though the maker of the pattern might have said that the quilt finishes before you put the borders at 50 inches by 72 inches, yours might be 49 inches by 72½ inches. And you want your borders to be cut to fit your center of the quilt. That being said, I cut my borders a ½ inch too short all the time. Because when you feed fabric, it stretches, and the border gets fed on top of the quilt, so the border gets laid on the top of the center of the quilt when you sew it on. And so I cut it a ½ inch too short, I pin the two far ends, and I pin the middle. That's all I pin. And I hold the middle, and I start sewing, and I hold pressure on that middle so that it feeds perfectly. And then when I get to the middle, I hold the end, and then I let that feed through perfectly. I always have flat, perfectly hanging quilts, and I think that ½ inch really makes a difference. So if anything, you'd want your borders to be a little bit too small rather than a little bit too big. Then you don't have the wobbly edges, you don't have a quilt that hangs poorly, and you don't have to square up your quilt when you're done, or mess with it. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, our next question here is from Carol, and she says, I know a group of seasoned hand quilters, but I'm just getting started machine quilting. I was taught to always wash and shrink my fabric before using it, particularly quilting cotton, and she wants to know what your take on the subject is, and if cotton batting shrinks or not.
Yes. Well, most of today's cotton battings don't shrink more than about an inch. I mean, more than about 1 to 1.5%. Which is exactly what you want it to shrink, because you want a little bit of that suck up, if you will, so that the quilting really shows very, very well. You'll notice there's a big difference between how your quilt looks right when you finish quilting it and how it looks after you've laundered it one time. And that's because everything kind of sucks up and you get that nice, just slight pucker. Even if it's a really contemporary quilt, you want that slight pucker so that you can see that stitch outline better. So no, we don't pre-wash our battings anymore. There was a time when our cotton battings all shrunk 5, 6, 7%. And if you didn't pre-wash them, then you get a really puckery quilt. But I have always been a pre-washer of fabric because fabric is unpredictable. One maker can have one fabric that runs and one fabric that doesn't. Another maker can have one fabric that frays and one that doesn't. Another maker can have a fabric that wrinkles like crazy and one that doesn't. And I want to know what a fabric is going to do before I use it. I want to know if I can trust that fabric. And a surefire way to know that is by throwing it in the washer and then throwing it in the dryer. I throw it in the dryer until it's almost dry. If you throw it in there until it's completely dry, then it's going to be a wrinkled mess. So I just throw it in there until it's almost dry, and then I take it out and I kind of smooth it out, let it finish drying, fold it up, and put it in my stash. Then I know what it's going to do. And if it misbehaves in the washer and dryer, I throw it out. I don't use it. It's not worth it to me. Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to be frustrated before you even start cutting anything out.
Exactly. Yep.
All right, I just want to remind anyone, if you're just tuning in, we're about halfway through, so about another half hour that Heather will be answering all of your quilting questions. So if you've been, saving a question, don't save it any longer. Go ahead and ask, and she will continue answering all of your questions.
I like Claudia's or Chandra's question right there. Did you see that?
Oh, we'll ask it right now.
Okay.
What type of fabric should I have in my stash, which will be useful for most quilt projects? I know you like your fabric stash.
You're my best friend tonight. This is my thing about stash. Some people buy their stash just for the joy of buying stash, and that's fine. Some people, I know people who buy fabric who don't even quilt because they think fabric's pretty. They put it in little squares and in little baskets around their room, and they just love it. And that's fine. But if you really want to use it, and that was the end of that question, that would be useful when making my quilts. Unfortunately, most of us buy beautiful fabric, and we don't buy useful fabric. There's a big difference between the two. The more colors present on a fabric, the less useful it is. Think about it. If it's got big floral with 8 different colors, it's not as useful as a fabric that has one color. So one color in 2 different shades or tones, a tone on tone, small little purple flowers on a dark purple background, yellow stripes on a yellow-orange background. Very, very simple in coloration, but more complex in the print. Lots of stripes, lots of polka dots, lots of flowers, lots of leaves, lots of mottling, all sorts of different surface design, but keep the coloration simple. So that if I have that wonderful multicolored fabric that's got 8 different colors in it, I have those 8 fabrics to go with it, those 8 colors of fabric to go with it. But unfortunately, we tend to go buy those fabrics we love, those beautiful ones, and our stash is filled with them, and we have no useful fabrics to use with them. And then we end up not using our beautiful fabrics. So I had a thing where for every beautiful fabric I bought at a store, I had to buy all the colors present in that fabric. So if I bought a yard of a wonderful print, then I would buy a 1/4 yard or a 1/3 of a yard or a 1/2 of a yard of all the colors present in that fabric. And that way I built up my stash with very useful fabrics. Don't be fooled into buying the whole line. The whole line is all the same colors in mostly all the same tone or shade or tint. And it's not enough interest. It's not enough play. You want to have, in your yellow selection of your fabrics in your stash, you want to have tints, tones, shades, pure hues of yellow. And you want to have little prints and big prints and medium-sized prints, and you want fancy prints and simple things. You want a nice variety, because variety is what, it's the spice of life. It's what makes our quilts interesting. So yeah, the simpler color in a fabric, the more useful that fabric is.
Perfect. And I know you touched on this a little bit during last month's question about building your stash, which was how much. I mean, you mentioned a yard, a 1/2 yard. How much would you buy of a certain fabric?
And that depends on the size of quilt you make. If you tend to make bed quilts, then I would never buy less than a 1/2 yard. If you tend to only make wall quilts and table runners and small pieces and purses and bags and stuff, then you can get by with those fat quarters. If you're buying that beautiful print because you think you're going to use it in a quilt, think about borders. A lot of times we use that beautiful print as our border, and then we usually want to include it somewhere inside the body of the quilt, in maybe the center of a star block or something. So I would say 3 yards of that wonderful fabric. So 1/2 yards and 3 yards for bed-size quilts. You can get by with fat quarters and 1 yard of a focus fabric for lap quilts and throw quilts.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Susan, and she says, why do so many quilters frown on tying a quilt versus other ways of quilting, as by hand or with a long arm?
Well, you know, everybody's got an opinion, and everybody thinks that what they were told or what they practice is the way to go. There's a way, every way that we can think of doing a quilt can suit a quilt. It just depends on what your expectation of that quilt is. If you tie a quilt, it's not going to last as long as a very well quilted quilt. So if you're going to use the bejeebers out of the quilt and you've tied it, you're going to get a few years out of it. If you're going to use the bejeebers out of that same quilt and you've lightly machine quilted it, you'll get a few more years than you did with the tying. If you're going to use the bejeebers out of that quilt and you heavily quilt it, you're going to get more years out of it. You put the bejeebers out of it, or you tie it, or you quilt it lightly, and you never use that quilt, it's going to last forever. So it just depends on how that quilt is going to be used. But all these methodologies are acceptable methodologies. It just will affect the longevity of the quilt. It will affect the quilt's lifespan.
Absolutely. And it just comes down to personal preference, what you want it to look like also.
Yeah.
All right, our next one here is from Denise, and she says that they would like to make some baby quilts for local hospitals for preemies, and they want to know if you have any special tips for making a large quantity of small quilts.
Yes, I do. So first of all, do not use polyester. Do not use minky, even though they're very, very attractive. There are a couple of different fabrics that you can use if you don't want to use regular quilting cottons. One is called a double gauze, and it is like regular gauze, but it's 2 layers of gauze that have a fiber that weaves the two together, and it's called double gauze. It's wonderful for baby quilts. And then the other is flannel, but you want to use the lightweight flannel, not the heavier flannels. So, or you can use regular quilting cottons. What I like to do for small quilts for hospitals is I will put, after I've pieced the top, I will put it on top of the backing, the right sides together, and lay that on top of the batting. Then I will sew all the way around it, leaving a small opening. Trim excess batting after I've sewn all the way around it, turn it right side out. Now my edges are already finished and I don't have to put a binding on it. And then I lightly quilt it. I usually quilt it in the piecing lines and maybe some diagonal lines across it, or with a really big stipple. We only want to lightly quilt it. This is a baby quilt. It's only going to be used while that baby's a baby, and it may only be used in the hospital while the baby's a baby. So the edges are already finished. You can't heavily quilt those quilts, however, because you'll be pushing out excess to that outside edge, and then you're going to end up with this wonkiness on that edge. So just really light quilting, which is all you want to do for charity quilts anyway, especially for hospital quilts. But then you have that finished edge, you don't have to put bindings on. It works really well.
Perfect. And this is a question that kind of goes along with that. Gloria wants to know, can I use the backing to wrap around and use it for the binding?
Well, yes, you can, but that goes back to, you know, should I tie, should I quilt, what do I do? Yes, you can. However, one of the things that wears out fast on a lot of quilts is the binding. And if you've pulled the backing to the front, it wears out even faster because that back edge isn't doubled. And most of the time when we put a binding on, it's called a double French, and it's got 2 layers of fabric in it. And we pull it all the way around. And it's not that we want that second layer so that when the top layer wears out, the second layer's there. It's that when the 2 layers are there, it keeps the top layer stronger. So it's not going to be as strong as a double French binding, number 1. Number 2, when it does wear out, it's going to wear out on the back side of the quilt too, not just the front side of the quilt. So when you go to put a new binding on, you either have to cut the edge of the quilt off or cover that, leave it on there and cover it with another binding, which is a little bit cumbersome. So I don't think it's necessarily the best way to go, but if that's what you want to do, you can, absolutely.
Perfect. All right, our next question here comes from Grace, and she wants to know how you deal with making mistakes on your quilts. I've gotten discouraged and wanted to give up.
Well, what was her name again?
Grace.
Grace? Grace, I've never made a mistake on a quilt. Ever.
You just change what you want to do, right?
Exactly. I don't really believe in mistakes. When I go into my creative space, everything that happens in my creative space was meant to happen. It's either meant to happen to teach me a lesson, to help me problem solve, to help me work around and do something new, to get out of my rut. And I have never let any of those mishaps or road or lane changes really get in my way, because I happen to like the stump. I like being stumped. I like the quilt looking at me going, well, now what are you going to do? I like that because I like to be able to problem solve. So if you feel like you're making mistakes all the time, chances are you're learning a lot, because all human beings learn more from their mistakes than they do from their successes. Most people don't know that. Most people haven't been told that. Successes teach us very, very little because we don't internalize them in the same way. Each time we make a mistake, we really take that information to heart, and it kind of gets sealed in our brain and becomes valued information. Instead of, when we take new information in, we either put it in short-term memory, long-term memory, or the garbage can. And a lot of times when something is easily successful, whatever we did during that gets thrown in the garbage can, because our brain doesn't realize that it's important information. But those mistakes, they get sent to that long-term memory, because we spend more time with them and we spend more time trying to figure them out. So I say embrace those mistakes. Embrace them. And as you hit a mistake, ask yourself, instead of saying to yourself, oh my God, I did it wrong, it's not the way the pattern said or the book said, say, okay, well, this is what I've got. What can I do with it now? What can I do with it now? And I guarantee if you can't figure it out on your own, you can click that little problem into YouTube and you'll find an answer, because all the answers in the world are on YouTube, or they're on our site. But you can find a way around it. Don't let it get in your way. Again, everything that I know about quilting and everything that all the people out there who are in the professional quilting world know about quilting, they learned by doing it, and they learned by screwing it up and having to figure it out. And kind of embrace that. I just think it's fabulous. I love the mistake. I love the, whoops, now what am I going to do? So maybe try to think about changing your perspective, make it a positive.
And just going back to you saying, just figure it out, if you want to tell your story on how you first learned how to quilt. Like, you didn't get a pattern, right?
I didn't get a pattern. Yeah, so
figure it out.
Yeah, when I first started quilting, I went to my grandmother and asked her to help me make a quilt, and she had been a quilter for a long time, a junk quilter now. I know now, because she just used old clothes mostly, but I knew her grandmother had been a kind of a very nice quilter, made some really great pieces, and I said, do you have any patterns? And she said, yeah, they're in the bottom drawer of the bureau. And so I went to the bureau to look for these patterns, and all I found were these blocks, and there were these 9-piece blocks, and one was a Tin Man, and one was a boat, and there were some regular squares. I mean, they were some pretty complex blocks, and I brought them out to my grandmother. I said, I found the blocks, but I didn't find the patterns. And she goes, silly, those are the patterns. And I went, what? And she goes, that's why you always make one extra, because that's your pattern. And I was like, okay, now what do I do? And she goes, get your ruler and your notepad and measure everything and write down what it is, and then add your 1/4 inch all the way around. And so I had to learn from the very beginning how to do this, and it was the most fabulous thing, because I instantly understood how blocks were made, because I had to figure it out on my own. I had no book that said this is what you do. And so problem solving, it was wonderful, and all these blocks were different size, and they all ended up in my first quilt. I figured out how to put them together, because she wasn't going to help me. She just said do the math. And so I did the math, and I screwed up a lot, and I threw away a lot of fabric, but I finally did it, and that's how we learn. That's how we learn.
Great. Yep, I love that story. I think everyone should just give that a try one time.
Yeah.
All right, our next question here comes from Jackie, and she says, I've been playing with paper piecing. I trim and press after sewing each piece, but I'm having a problem with wrinkles. I've tried steam, without steam, misting. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, don't iron so much. Yeah, I very rarely press in paper piecing with each seam. What I do is I finger press. When you press all the time, what happens is when you're pressing and the fabric is hot, it pulls it out, and then when it gets cool, it pushes it back in, and you're basically distorting the fabric back and forth. And that paper is helping distort it too. Now, paper piecing is one of the most exact things if you do it exactly. But so what I do is after sewing a seam, I flip the fabric over, and I use my 2 thumbs. I start in the middle of the piece of fabric I just sewed on, and I push my thumbs away. Let's see, like this. on that seam, really hard. You don't want to start on one side and go this way because you're going to push it off of the seam. This way you're pushing up away from the seam and you get a nice finger press, a really crisp finger press. Then I pin that piece of fabric in place before I put the next piece of fabric on. And most people don't do that. It really helps keep things nice and tidy. Then I sew the next piece on and I finger press. And I'll finger press 3 or 4 times and then I take my iron. Now, when I iron for the paper piecing and any other kind of piecing, I am not really ironing. I happen to be using the iron as my tool, but what I'm doing is pressing. And most people iron, they push. And that's not what you do in quilting. You press. You put it down on the seam that you already put into place, then you lift it up. And so if you're pushing, again, you're distorting the fabric, and you're going to end up with wrinkles and rumples and all sorts of things. But to make sure you don't get wrinkles, pin that new piece of fabric in place before you set down the next piece of fabric for piecing, and that will really help.
Absolutely, and just to throw one more plug out there for Heather's videos on our site. She does have one that is for paper piecing, so if anyone out there is thinking about giving it a try, she's got a video that's a really good tutorial on how to do the paper piecing and explains the finger pressing and the pinning and all of that too. So perfect. All right, our next one comes from Connie, and she says, do you quilt a design on your quilt before or after you put the borders on?
Well, I do all of my piecing first and all of my quilting second. However, you can, if you want to, put the borders on later. I don't know what the advantage would be to that, because the borders really aren't that bulky, and you'd already need the batting and the backing for those borders on there. So I don't necessarily think that that's easier or less time-consuming or anything like that. I would say yes, you can if you want to, but no, I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay, perfect. Our next question here I'm excited about because I don't actually know what it is, so I'm excited to hear your answer. But someone wants to know, they want to do a crumb quilt and was wanting to know if you have any tips.
I have no idea what a crumb quilt is.
All right, we're going to need a follow-up. We need a definition of what the crumb quilt is, and then we can go about answering this, but I don't know what it is either.
I don't know. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll see if we can get a follow-up on that.
Okay.
We've got about 15 more minutes, so we still have time. So if you're watching, explain to us what a crumb quilt is, and we'll get you some tips. Our next one here is from Denise, and she says, do you have suggestions on using batiks? If using yardage, is pre-washing recommended? What do you do if you're using pre-cuts?
If you're using what?
Pre-cuts? Oh, pre-cuts, yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the perils of pre-cuts, is that you really can't do any pre-washing very easily. Batiks generally don't run, but that being said, a deep, deep red or a deep, deep blue could very much could run quite a bit. The way batiks are made, they have wax on them. They're still made the old-fashioned way with wax. They have to be laundered a lot to get that wax out, and laundered with hot water, and this pulls out all that excess dye. So they're usually not a problem when it comes to running. Like a lot of some of the other fabrics we have so much pigment set on the surface to get rich colors that the fabric can only take so much, and so it sits on the surface and it comes off when you launder it. But batiks don't do that often. But solid batiks that don't have a print on them, that haven't had a wax laid down, they can do some running because they have excess dye in them because they haven't been laundered as often. So again, that's why I pre-wash everything. And I pre-wash all of my fabrics in Synthropol. Synthropol can be purchased at almost any good quilt store. If not, you can get it online with no problem. It's simply an industrial surfactant. And what it does is it pulls out the excess dyes, suspends them in the water so that they can't go back down on the fabrics. So I can hand dye fabric or use batiks in my Synthropol. I can put a black fabric in and a pale yellow fabric in, and the black will not go down on that pale yellow. You're going to have total safety in those colors, and you know what's going to happen with your fabrics. You get all excess color out, and you don't have to think about it again. So other than that, batiks, definitely don't over dry them in the dryer, because they will wrinkle fast, and the reason they wrinkle fast is because they are generally made on a fabric that has a higher thread count, but the thread is very, very, very thin. So even though it's a higher thread count, the fabric is thinner, and because it's a higher thread count, there's more threads per inch, and so pulls in more when you dry it, and so they wrinkle really quickly. So make sure you don't dry them all the way. Pull them out just before they're dry, and then just kind of smooth them flat and let them air dry the rest of the way.
Perfect. All right, we do have an update on what a crumb quilt is. And a crumb quilt is when you use a bunch of small scraps and sew them all together. And you sew them together into strips or blocks rather than using a crazy quilt style.
Okay. Okay. So what was the original question then? Do I have any
suggestions? Yeah, and we just want to thank all the viewers out there who defined crumb quilts for us.
Okay. Well, I'm assuming then that you have tons and tons of seam allowance if you've got lots of little pieces that you're sewing together. And then I imagine that you are then cutting it into blocks and piecing it together, or cutting it into some sort of unit to piece together. So my first suggestion would be to make sure that you press it well as you sew those crumbs together, and that you don't end up with any bad surprises later where any dark fabrics are showing through into some light fabrics because of how you've pressed things. And I would make sure that I still used quality fabrics. I wouldn't use, you know, junk fabric that somebody gave me and throw it together in a crumb quilt and think that because I've used all these fabrics sewn together with all those seams, it's going to be a good fabric. I also would use a very thin batting. If it's got all that seam allowance, that's going to be kind of chunky and hard to sew through. So I would use a thin batting, and I would probably do some sort of all-over quilting in it rather than anything really fancy, so that I don't have to worry about all those seam allowances.
Perfect. Awesome. I just want to, again, thank you to all the viewers who answered what is a crumb quilt for us, and gave Heather some direction on where she can give some great tips for that. All right, our next question here is from Barbara, and she wants to know what type of batting you recommend for a tablecloth.
For tablecloth?
Mm-hmm.
There's one batting that I recommend for tablecloths only. I don't use it for anything else, but I use it on almost all of my tablecloths, and that is Warm and Natural. I like Warm and Natural for tablecloths because it tends to be a little thicker than most battings, and so if I set a hot dish down on my table runner, it acts like a trivet almost, and so that's the main reason I use that. Also, I can quilt it pretty heavily, and it's going to remain nice and flat, and so it's going to drape nicely or lay flat on the tabletop, and it's just a great table topper, the Warm and Natural.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Sandra, and she says, do you ever use sheets or something other than batting for batting?
I don't. You can make what's called a coverlet, like a summer or spring coverlet, and not have any batting whatsoever. You just have the front and the back, and then some people will put a sheet in there instead of batting, so that you can't see the seams through. And that really helps keep that down. But I haven't done it before, but people do it all the time. Your better bet than a sheet, though, is to use batiks. And that's a very thin, strong fabric. The problem with using sheets is that they have such a high thread count that they're very hard to needle through. That's why we don't use them for the back of our quilts. And putting one in the middle of a quilt is going to get, you're going to break machine needles because it's so strong. And if you're hand quilting, it's going to be a nightmare because sheets are so tightly woven.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Charlene, and she wants to say, first of all, Heather, I'd like to say how much I enjoy your projects and admire your skills and talents, as I think we all do. Her question is, when using vintage fabric in a quilt or wall hanging, what special prep needs to be done to be able to use it with new fabrics, or should vintage fabrics not be used with newer fabrics?
The most important thing with the vintage fabrics is that they have a thread count that is similar to the fabrics you're going to be using new. If they don't, then I wouldn't put the two together. The best way to determine the thread count is to make a little tiny cut along the edge of the fabric, 1/4 of an inch from one end, and then count how many threads are in that 1/4 inch. These days, most quilting fabrics have 40 threads per inch, and so for 1/4 inch, you'd have, 10 threads. But I think most vintage fabrics had 26 threads. So in that 1/4 inch, you're only going to have less than 10. You're going to have like six threads. So that's the biggest issue, is that one is more tightly woven than the other and is going to wear quicker. The thinner one is the one with less threads per inch is going to wear faster. The other problem is the vintage fabric clean? Because its dirtiness is what can make it break down. Our quilts can break down because of the way we launder them, because of how we use them, but they can also break down because they're dirty. And moths love a dirty quilt. So if there's dirty fabric in your quilt, it will attract moths. Moths don't eat wool because they love wool. They like the dirt that's in the wool, and the way wool is woven, it holds dirt, and people don't wash wool very often. So we need to make sure that that vintage fabric is clean. So you might want to hand wash it first and do that comparison of the weave. If they are close to each other in the weave, then go ahead and use them. If it's clean, go ahead and use them. You should be fine.
So you mentioned hand washing those vintage fabrics. Are you using anything other than just water? What would you wash them with?
I would probably use Retain. That's another product. People think that Retain and Synthropol are the same thing, but Retain does the opposite of Synthropol. As it's gently cleaning a fabric, it pushes the dyes back into the fabric and holds them so that they don't lose their color. And that a lot of people want to use that on older quilts that are losing their color, so that when you launder them, the color doesn't come out even more. So Retain is there to help you retain the color, and so that's what I would launder old fabrics or old quilts with.
Perfect. All right, our next question here is from Janet, and she wants to know, do you still teach the year-long color class that you developed?
Janet, I'm sorry, I don't. Right now I'm not teaching it at all, and except for the classes that I'm teaching online with National Quilters Circle. So I do have the color class coming out soon. It's not the year long. However, I would highly suggest that you take that color class, buy the book, and do the study yourself. Now, if you have enough friends or know anybody, grab some friends and ask them to do it with you. When I first started learning about color, I learned it in a study group with a bunch of other quilters in a guild who were interested in learning about color. And we each searched out some books on color that had nothing to do with quilting, because at the time there were no books on color for quilters, or I think there was one. And we all just kind of led each other. But it's easier to learn about color if there's lots of different people doing it, because what they learn is going to be different from what you learn, and then you learn from them and they learn from you, and so your growth is exponential compared to what it would be all by yourself. So no, I'm not teaching it as a year-long color class anymore, but yes, I've got it coming up online, and my book has all 12 of the lessons that I used to teach in it, and it is still available. So hopefully that can help you out.
Perfect. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, are we going to have a link to your book available with the class so
Actually,
they can find it?
You'll be selling the book on your site. And I think that you can get it as a group, the book and the color book and a color wheel all together. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, next question here is from Ken, and he also says, thank you for all of the wonderful information that you're sharing. In one of your earlier videos, you mentioned cutting 2 or 3 pieces of fabric at once as a method for improving your cutting accuracy, and he wants to know how that improves your cutting. Also, he says he's a left-handed cutter, and he finds the fabric moves a lot and wants to know if you have any suggestions for southpaws.
Okay. Well, make sure, first of all, that you're using a rotary cutter meant for a left-hander. And there's a new one out that you can cut off of either side, so you can use it left or right-handed, which is great. I think Ashley might be looking for hers.
I do have one somewhere.
Yeah, I have one too, because I will cut with my left hand if my right hand's busy doing something else. Whether you're right-handed or left-handed should not affect how your accuracy. What does affect your accuracy is how you're holding your ruler and whether you're measuring off your ruler, measuring off the mat. I prefer to measure off the ruler, so my fabric can be positioned anywhere on the mat. I use the ruler to do my cutting, so it doesn't matter that the mat is directed from a right-hand standpoint. You could even turn it over and have no lines at all, and sometimes that helps. My first mat had no lines, and so I've always used the ruler to measure. And those people go, but how do I do long borders and stuff like that? Well, sometimes you need 2 rulers, one that's doing one side and one that's doing the other. But that being said, Make sure that you have a left-handed rotary cutter, and make sure that you watch my video that's coming on soon about the pinky and what the pinky does. So basically, the pinky comes off the edge of the ruler, and you hold that pinky kind of at a little angle, and your hand is like a claw, not flat. So your hand's like a claw. That would be your right hand because you're going to be cutting with your left hand. And when you hold that off right at the edge of that ruler, it keeps the ruler from moving so much and from slipping. And it's very, very helpful. The claw is also a much more, it sounds like a claw, but it's much more relaxed than the flat hand where you put too much pressure on it and things move. But the hand position, using the ruler to measure off of instead of the board, and then making sure you've got a good left-handed rotary cutter. Hopefully that's helpful.
Well, and I couldn't find mine. It's not in my field of vision, but I know I'll find it as soon as we're done. But it's just like any other. You can just take down either side, and I think it just says either for left and right-handers or something like that. That makes it easy to know what it is.
It's an alpha. Yeah.
Oh yes, alpha. Yep. Yeah. So I want to thank you for answering all of these questions for the last hour. I want to thank everyone who tuned in and watched and submitted questions, even answered some of the questions that we had. So participating along with us, we love when people do that. And just remember that you can see visuals to a lot of the things that Heather mentioned on the site. She has a lot of tutorials and classes on there. And you also can ask questions at any time. Just submit them to through the website, and we will get back to you and answer questions all the time. So until next month, our next month's live event, if you have a burning question, go ahead and send it to us. But yeah, thank you again, Heather, for being here, and thanks everyone
for having me. See you next